years of the century and the second coming, things fall apart. The center cannot hold. New heading, new uses for traditional forms. 20th century writers found new uses for traditional forms such as the sonnet. In 20th century hands, the sonnet dealt with experiences undreamed of by the Elizabethans. The radical change in subject matter and tone can be seen by comparing sonnets written by two different World War I poets. The young and dashing Rupert Brooke wrote in The Soldier of the idealism that spurred many of his generation. However, Wilfred Owen's sonnet, Anthem for Doomed Youth, tells what happened when these idealistic young men encountered the turmoil of the Western Front. What passing bells for those who die as cattle is a line from the poem we'll study. Echoes of Romanticism. Although Ted Hughes's lyric, The Horses, differs in many ways from William Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, we can still hear an echo of Wordsworth in Hughes's celebration of nature and his distrust of cities. The next heading, the blossoming of the modern short story. The modern short story was invented in the 19th century. In the 20th century, however, it became a global genre. Just a few examples will show how authors were setting their tales everywhere and anywhere in the world. James Joyce, the top of page 1132. James Joyce in the streets of Dublin. Joseph Conrad in the jungles of the Malaysia. And Doris Lessing on the Rhodesian Veldt. I'm with you now on 1132, next paragraph. The subjects of these stories are as varied as their settings. Joyce writes about the coming of an age of infatuated boy. D.H. Lawrence in The Rocking Horse Winter tells a chilling story of twisted love and destructive greed. Elizabeth Bowen's The Demon Lover links both of the world wars in a few evocative pages. Doris Lessing and Nadine Gordimer deal with the thorny cultural and racial problems of a fading empire. By the way, do note again, essential question vocabulary there on 1132. Next question, heading, how did well-crafted poetry capture an unruly world? First heading, Sestina on the Troubles. Poets Seamus Heaney from Northern Ireland and Derek Walcott from St. Lucia both use well-ordered poetry to express the world's disorder. In the Sestina, Two Lorries, Heaney writes of the lingering violence in Ireland resulting from an incomplete separation, violence known as the Troubles. At first glance, a sestina with its intricate pattern of repeated N-words seems like the wrong form of capturing such a gritty reality. In this poet's hands, however, the repetitions evoke a repeated nightmare of violence that cannot be shaken. In Midsummer 23, Walcott writes about the violent racism experienced by people of color in antique England. Like Heaney's, his poem is deeply rooted in the English poetic tradition. It's filled with allusions to earlier work, but also expresses bitter contemporary realities. Final question, what happens to literary traditions in tumultuous times? Traditions change, especially in times of conflict, but they also endure and connect a living present with a vital past. T.S. Eliot said that any individual talent is best understood in terms of the tradition within which that talent is working. Eliot, who served as an air raid warden during the Blitz, wrote his poem Little Gidding during that dark time. This work links a perilous present to the literary past by invoking Shelley and Milton and the recently deceased Joyce and Yeats, a communion of writers. It invokes them at the intersection of a timeless moment that somehow contains both past and present, the timeless moment of a work of art. On page 1133, let's look at this contemporary connection to British tradition. George Orwell, more relevant than ever. Big Brother, newspeak, and double think are words that probably sound familiar because you hear them frequently. They were all coined in the 1940s by British author George Orwell for his novel 1984, published in 1949. After World War II, Orwell was alarmed by a trend toward repressive totalitarian rule, believing that language is the first weapon dictators use to seize power. He employed his own words as a warning. In the futuristic tyranny portrayed in his novel, words are used to obscure and destroy meaning. They give you 4 bullet points here. The official language is called newspeak, has been stripped of meaning. The second bullet point, that tyrannical ruler is deceptively named Big Brother. The third bullet point, dissenters face torture in the innocently named Room 101. And finally, Citizens are adept at doublethink, the ability to accept blatant contradictions, as in the government declaration, war is peace. 60 years later, these terms and others coined by Orwell still ring true. In fact, Orwell's own name is used as an adjective, Orwellian, to describe this kind of abusive language. Pundits, reporters, citizens, and bloggers alike use Orwell's words to criticize Orwellian practices. The year 1984 has come and gone, but Orwell's words live on. Okay, let's turn now to page 1134 and the recent scholarship by Anita Desai, The English Language Takes Root in India. Introducing the author there on page 1134, Desai, who was born in 1937, born to a German mother and an Indian father, Desai spoke German at home in New Delhi, conversed in Hindi with friends, and learned English in school. Her works, written in English, often deal with the conflict between tradition and contemporary life. Let's just read. The Portuguese, the Dutch, and the French all came to India as traders. So did the British, but they stayed to govern. To trade and to govern, you need a common language with the people. In the French colony of Pondicherry, people were taught French. In the Portuguese colony of Goa, Portuguese. In the rest of India, a few English people did learn some Indian languages in order to compile dictionaries and to translate the Bible, but it was largely left to Indians to learn English if they wanted jobs or to do business. So, schools were set up across the country to teach the English language and also its literature. First heading. 2 languages, 2 worlds to occupy. I went to such a school myself, Queen Mary's School for Girls in Old Delhi. I was taught to read and write English before my own language, Hindi, and my first books were of English nursery rhymes and fairy stories. This was curious because they had nothing at all to do with our Indian world, its plants and animals, its festival and seasons, but they did provide me with a rich, imagined world in addition to the one we lived in and knew. And at home, with our families and neighbors, we spoke our own language. So there were always 2 languages and 2 worlds to occupy. Top of page 1135. I went on to read the English classics, Jane Austen and George Eliot, Charles Dickens and Henry James, as well as other literatures translated into English. And all the time, I was writing my own books about my own world, but in this other language, English. Next heading, expressing Indian thoughts in this foreign language, English. There were other Indian writers in those years who were also doing so while continuing to draw upon the rich Indian language literatures. Each of us had to experiment to find out how to express Indian thoughts and experiences in this foreign language. Sometimes we had to combine the languages if, say, we were describing an Indian ceremony or a meal for which there were no English words. After India won independence in 1947, writing in English was looked on with scorn. The English were gone, so why were we still using their language? We found ourselves having to explain how, after 300 years, a language could not simply vanish or be thrown aside. It had established roots in India, and by now had a tradition. Not as old as the literary traditions in the Indian languages, but still living, growing, one that belonged to our own complicated times. Next heading, a new form of the language, Indian English. Then, in 1980, a book called Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie was published. It was based on our own themes, the fight for freedom and the birth of 2 nations, India and Pakistan, and used our own epics, the Mahabharata as well as the Ramayana, as sources. But it was written in the polyglot language of the Indian streets, of newspapers and shop signs, the cinema and school grounds. It was bold, noisy, loud, and funny language. Rushdie's work won the Booker Prize, which showed that the English, too, were ready to read his new form of their language, Indian English. It gave many young writers in India the confidence to use Indian English. So things came together at last, and now there is as lively a literature in English as in Bengali and Tamil, Urdu, and Hindi, to name just a few of the Indian languages. If you look into it, I think you will find it as crowded and colorful and bustling as an Indian market or fair. Okay guys, so there you go, an introduction to Unit 6. Let's now turn and begin our study analysis of some of the titles in Unit 6. Thank you.